Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How Digital Transformation Disrupts Legacy Leaders. I'm Allison Ryder, Senior Project Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm joined today by Michael Schrage and Ben Pring, who are co-authors of the recent MIT SMR Cognizant Big Ideas Research Report, Leadership's Digital Transformation. We're really excited to share with you some of the key findings from this report that launched just a few weeks back, and encourage you to check that out if you'd like some further information about the study and some of our findings that were recently uncovered. Our speakers today, as mentioned, are Michael Schrage. He's a research fellow at the MIT Sloan School of Management's Initiative on the Digital Economy, and he's also the MIT SMR guest editor for this Future of Leadership initiative that we have been conducting in partnership with Cognizant. Ben Pring is Vice President of Thought Leadership at Cognizant, and he has co-founded and currently leads Cognizant's Center for the Future of Work. He's a co-author of a number of best-selling and award-winning books on how new technologies are changing the future of work. And as mentioned, I'm the Senior Project Editor here at MIT SMR and had the fortune of working with this team on the research, so I'm happy to share some of the details behind it as well. Then let me hand things to you to get us started, talking a little bit about the history and how we got here. And our speakers may turn off their cameras, but we'll be back for the Q&A for that more personal connection.
Thank you, Alison, and hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be around the world. If you're joining us live, thank you. If you're watching on demand, nice to have you along as well. Yes, as Alison says, this is the second year of the relationship, of the project-based relationship we've had with SMR, and it's been exciting to work on, obviously, a very, very important theme, a very important topic, the future of leadership. As Alison mentioned, we produced a report last year in 2020, the first report that we've done together, which we launched at Davos in person in January of last year. Shame we can't be doing that again this year. But that was an important piece of work which was well received in the marketplace, really kind of looking at the role of leadership in a world changing probably faster than ever, driven by new technology, but also driven by new cultural aspects, social aspects, mores of the modern world, if you like. And the report last year really sort of raised two very important findings, two sort of very important perspectives. One was that only 12% of the respondents in that work, in that report, felt that their leadership had the right mindset to drive their businesses forward in this rapidly changing world. Only 12%. That was a bit of a shocking statistic. And then the other stat that really jumped out in that work was that less than half of the respondents felt that their organizations could actually compete in the digital economy. So pretty stark, pretty blunt, pretty negative assessment of leadership's ability and capability to lead in this rapidly changing world. And that's really what we wanted to further dig into in this new report that we were conducting through the majority of last year, and which, as Alison says, we've just launched, but is looking further into this tension around leadership's role at the moment. We'll share some of the initial sort of key takeaways, if you like, from the report, that this perceived disconnect between the digital skills needed in the modern world and leaders' digital fluency is a very, very real phenomena. And it's our contention that there's a new language of business, not just a programming language, but there's a new language, period, that people need to speak in this new world. And simply put, many leaders are not speaking that language. They don't know that language. They don't speak it, and consequently, they're struggling. A lot of this disconnect, and we're going to talk about this in some detail, this disconnect is now orientating around itself around the notion of purpose, a fashionable term perhaps, but a term that is very real in the marketplace. This purpose gap, if you like, between what employees want and what employers want. Employees wanting perhaps more meaning in their work than just simply satisfying the shareholders, and the leadership in large organizations trying to balance the need to still continue to serve that constituency, but a broader constituency, and the terms I'm sure you're very familiar with, the transition from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. It is a very, very real phenomenon. And then, of course, what the research this year really surfaces again very starkly is that all of these underlying fundamental tensions, which have been bubbling up for a long period of time, clearly, have all been exacerbated, rocket fuel charged, if you like, by this existential moment we're going through. Something that we're all struggling with personally, corporately, societally. This moment, which is probably the biggest existential challenge since the Second World War, is just putting more pressure on leaders than ever before. It's a tough time, frankly, to be a leader, and that message really comes through very loud and clear in the report. Michael, would you care to jump in and add some context thoughts, if you like?
I'm happy to add some context thoughts. The most important thing for me has really been that I'm not really a leadership person. I'm more of a digital technology person, a digital transformation person. And so I was sort of curious as to see how the boundaries and the degrees of freedom changed for leaders as the technology changed. And here's really the key thing, what we learned. That in a perverse sort of way, I kind of feel that a lot of the work that I've been involved with and MIT's been involved with, we've gotten digital transformation wrong. We have focused on how can digital transformation make organizations more efficient and more effective and more productive. And when we really listened to and looked at the survey results and the interviews, what we really found more often than not is that as important as an economically effective transformation was, affective transformation mattered just as much or more. And that leaders, as you pointed out from that first study, Ben, leaders wanted their organizations to change more than they themselves were prepared to change. We also saw that technology was fundamentally changing the contexts in which people and organizations communicated. You alluded to earlier, what we're going to call context collapse, and that the boundaries between work and home have been dissolved, individual and institutional have been dissolved, and personal and professional have been dissolved. You talked about shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism. The distinctions between shareholders and stakeholders is dissolved. Social media has done that. And the final point, and it's not like it made me feel sorry for leaders, but it made me feel more sensitive to some of the obstacles they face, is that context collapse, digital media, digital transformation inside the firewall and out have made leaders more transparent, visible, and vulnerable. And so here we are, you'll see in the interviews, we've talked to these terrific people, but one of the common themes is they all feel more exposed. They all feel more vulnerable. They don't feel more empowered. They feel more accountable. And that was a really interesting takeaway for me, and I think for you as well, Ben.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, just to drive this home, again, there are cynics out there, skeptics out there, clearly, who look at this burgeoning sense of this phrase of purpose, perhaps, with a jaundiced eye, but it is very real for some of the reasons Michael was just saying. It is a very real phenomenon. Anybody with an eye on the news at the moment, seeing what's happening to KPMG, will have a reality check on how powerful these forces are, and the role of leadership in corralling them, in channeling them, in harnessing them is a very, very real one. So purpose is more than lip service, if you like. It's becoming a defining quality, a defining mission statement, I think, for all forms of leadership at the moment. The point that Michael just made, again, this notion that maybe digital is for other people, but not for me. And we'll get into this a little bit more in some recommendations, some thoughts about how leaders can become more digital, more active socially, perhaps, and how to take that seriously and be effective, create real results in using these channels and using these new modes of communication. We'll talk a little bit more about what context collapse really is in this strange moment in which, you know, you can see inside my house and I can see inside your house, and a very, very different style of working that many people all around the world are getting used to at the moment.
If I could just quickly interject on that, I think one of the things people looking at the slide should come away with is there is still, for all the discussion of affective versus effective, there still is very much a data-driven and analytics component to this. We see diversity, equity, and inclusion incorporated throughout this, but not just necessarily from a do-good perspective, but from an analytics perspective. And the notion of how do we track leadership example set? How do we measure these things? How do we use digital technologies to visualize? So I want to stress, there really is a digital leadership, digital data-driven envisioning aspect of this transformation report. And I think that's key. And I hope you keep that in your mind as the rest of this rolls out.
Allison, back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I just wanted to share a little bit more context behind our research methodology for the study before we get into more of the detail of what we uncovered. Just to give you a sense of some of the executives we spoke to nearly 20 executives, thought leaders, academics in this space of leadership, and who are expert in kind of dealing with the forces that are coming into play right now. Here's just a sampling of the people that we talked to on this. And to give you a sense of the full scope of companies, organizations, and academic institutions that were profiled, they're listed here. And more detail and insights from all of these speakers and thinkers are available inside the report. So I do encourage you to take a look at that if we don't touch on these specific companies or executive perspectives, but they are of interest to you.
Yes, I think one of the purposes here is not just to recapitulate the report, it's to tell you what we've learned and discussed since publishing the report. One of our goals, one of our KPIs for this is we want you to download and read the report. It's quite good.
We do, but we also recognize, you know, this is such a fast changing environment. And so as I speak about the survey that was conducted, you know, we want to make a point that we started thinking about this line of inquiry in the spring of 2020, and we fielded our survey between June 20th and July 1st. So, you know, people I think can maybe remember that time. I know time tends to blend together in some strange ways for us all, but you know, imagine that whether you're in the US or abroad, that you were experiencing, you know, some kind of restriction on typical life. You probably were not commuting to your office. You know, you may not have had access to the businesses and amenities that you were used to. And particularly in the US and some other specific places, you know, thinking about the other factors at play, you know, other elements of our lives that we wouldn't necessarily have talked about at work before or had impact our work as much as they did this summer. So this is the context of when we gather these insights. I think, you know, some of the findings we have would be even more strong, and some of these disconnects would be even more broad had we asked these same questions a month, 2 months, 3 months later. I mean, this is a constantly shifting environment, but this moment in time, I think, captures a good benchmarking element for us as we think about what these key factors are that have changed things, and what the implications are just in general for organizations and their employees. So to give you a sense of who was profiled for this, nearly 4,300 global survey respondents, 3/4 of them came from outside the United States. These are business to business and business to consumer organizations in over 25 industries, representing various levels from individual contributors up to C-suite leaders. So we did look at a very broad spectrum of people and organizations, all completely anonymous, but giving us some insight to really help us ground the studies. We then went and talked to these specific experts, leaders in the field, to add some color to this, to understand a little bit more about why we might be seeing something in these numbers and things of that nature. So these studies really are qualitative and quantitative, bringing those together to understand, you know, what's going on and what can we make of this. And so much of today's talk is, here's the grounding data that we have, and what did we synthesize from that? what takeaways and best practices can we share with you as that you can take back into your organizations and continue to work and lead through this time that, you know, I can say unprecedented or challenging or any of those buzzwords that, you know, are not changing as the environment continues to be fluctuating and very difficult. Michael, did you want to share a little bit more context about some of our findings?
I do, but let me begin with getting rid of me and stick with these movie stars. Let me begin with what I think is the fundamental disruption here. Almost 100 years ago, you had the silent movies taken over by the talkies, 1925, 1926, 1927. Sound changed everything. It changed everything. It changed the ways actors acted, directors directed. It changed the way you shot the film. The original Vitaphone was not sound on film, but sound on a disc. You had to retrofit all the theaters. The orchestras were gone. The sound systems were put in. The whole notion of what a movie was fundamentally changed, and everybody had to change along with it. And some of those people didn't change the technology. They weren't lesser artists, but they couldn't adapt as well. You know, Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd are icons. Velma Banks came from Hungary. She had a she was lovely. She had a very thick accent, didn't translate well into sound. She was great with Rudy Valentino, silent, not so good in sound. And I think we're in the exact same kind of situation today. Digital transformation has been as disruptive to traditional legacy notions of leadership as sound was to popular entertainment in the silent film era. Everything has to change. The expectations of the customers, audience, supply chain, everything has changed. And that's the assumption that we began with, and it really stood out. If you could move to the next slide. The biggest impact that I see that is analogous to the arrival of sound to silent pictures is context collapse. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Teams, Zoom, the notion of your ability to communicate to targeted audiences, you know, that's been flattened. Digital media, digital transformation creates a new world of context. And something that it's like what Ben was saying at the very beginning. People are you working from home or are you living at work? Is something that you say in your personal life that gets shared with some of your customers going to get you fired? That's not a hypothetical question anymore. So context collapse has been looked at. It was coined by a Microsoft researcher, Dana Boyd, over a decade ago. Mark Zuckerberg has talked about the importance of context collapse. Facebook, of course, is one of the prime generators of it. I think that every leader, every employee, everybody at work today lives in a context collapsed world. And I think one of the great leadership struggles is how do you maintain your leadership effectiveness, authenticity, and credibility in a world where literally every digital message you put out there can appear in circumstances or in contexts you did not anticipate, you did not create, you did not anticipate. I think that's a huge deal, and we identified several ways that that has changed leadership behavior. Do you want to do the next slide?
We have a series of leadership gaps that we uncovered. I think we wanted to ask you all first to maybe give us a sense of how many of these statements you would say apply to you. So you can check off all, none, one, but please take a look at these and see what applies to you and your organization. Is it important to have a mass of digitally savvy leaders? Are your project teams deliberately diverse in terms of digital savvy? Is your organization assessing if managers are improving their digital skills? And do you have a reverse mentoring system in place? And Our poll tool doesn't allow for the full text of the question that was asked in our survey, which is that you have a reverse mentoring system in place to improve the digital savviness of top management. So is your organization placing concerted effort on having, younger, potentially, or more digitally savvy workers mentoring other more tenured employees with the aim of improving their digital competencies?
I just want to stress that these gaps were intensified and exacerbated both by the COVID crisis and by context collapse. So this is terrific.
Okay, so we can see this. Yeah, you can see the data. So this, I think, is not dissimilar from what we saw in our survey. Before I jump to that slide, just give you a minute to digest that. Does this bring up any initial reactions, Ben or Michael?
I'm just looking at the differential between this and the slide we're just about to show, and they're actually pretty spot on.
They're remarkably similar, aren't they?
Remarkably similar.
Nearly, maybe not even statistically different in some instances. So I think you all can see on screen now what our survey showed. So this is 4,300 folks, and their responses mirror yours quite well. And so what this means, I think we saw this across our survey too, that the majority of respondents said, yes, having a critical mass of digitally savvy leaders matters when it comes to our organization's ability to compete, to win. But then you see this drop off of, but are your project teams deliberately diverse in terms of that digital competency? Are you actively monitoring or assessing if managers improve those skills? Do you have a reverse mentoring system in place? So it's kind of this walk the talk sort of thing where, yes, people say this matters, but are the actions of the organization actually reflecting that these behaviors are leading to that outcome? Michael, if you don't have any further comments on this one, we can talk about the purpose disconnect as well.
I think the only thing I want to say here is that it was a very interesting thing that digitalism has won. Everybody's digital. What's intriguing is that, and remember, this is a perception. This may not be reality, but this is what people perceive. That people really don't perceive that their organizations are as intent on cultivating the digital expertise of their managers and leaders as they are in the people themselves. And these create gaps and disconnects. And I think that hurts the credibility of leaders who are championing digital transformation as essential for success. I think it's a big deal, and I think it ties directly into the purpose point about to be presented.
So here's that point. We didn't ask you all these questions. We could have as well. Be curious to see if we get a similar response. But we asked our respondents how much these different statements about purpose, how much they agreed with those. And you see a similar drop, right? That just shy of 3/4 of the respondents said that it's very important to them to work in an organization with a purpose they believe in. But do they believe in their organization's purpose? Well, slightly fewer than half do. Do they believe in their organization's ability to advance its purpose? 36%. And then 1/4 believe that their organization is as purpose-driven as its leaders believe it to be. So we see another drop off here of those who strongly agree with this statement, really changing from they care about having purpose in their organizational lives, but then is that really enacted?
Yeah, and if we move into the next slide, Allison, this quote here from Ed Bastian of Delta, I think in a way really, again, exemplifies what we're talking about, this growing appreciation of how existential, again, taking purpose seriously is, prior to COVID, but now in the midst of COVID. This was one of the quotes that really jumped out at us in real time, chatting with Ed, and is a central kind of theme of the overall report. It's pretty remarkable for anyone who's been in business for any length of time to hear a very, very senior, very prominent leader say something as strong as this. Somewhat not contradictory, but counter to a lot of the messaging that typical CEOs of big institutions and organizations around the world would how they would typically communicate. So for him to sort of really call this out is a moment of sea change, I think. Again, in the analysis that we've done, presented in a lot of detail in the report, you can begin to see the impact that purpose as a sorting mechanism between leaders and folks who are, perhaps again struggling to change as effectively as that they really hope, and are communicating to the street and to the market at large. Because look at these deltas between the organizations that really are acting on making material the notion of a purpose beyond just shareholder satisfaction, and those that aren't. I mean, these are very, very significant deltas. I'm sure you're reading along as I'm talking, but basically the takeaway: 40% of the respondents believe of the companies struggling believe they don't have the right management. 60% believe that their organizations aren't building the right talent pipelines. 70% believe their organizations aren't monitoring whether or not leaders are becoming more digitally relevant and digitally savvy and more aligned with clearly where the market is going. Whereas the organizations that are making this central to what they're trying to do are having much greater success. So again, the data, to Michael's point earlier on, is telling a pretty clear story here. This is beyond just theory at the moment. This is becoming very, very material and real in the world. Again, this next quote that you're just about to see from Kevin Johnson on really taking this seriously. Again, this is the debate that's been going on for a while, hasn't it? I'm sure people saw the debate in the New York Times in the autumn, in the fall of last year, between people on the Friedman side of this discussion and not. And for, again, a very, very prominent, high-profile leader like Kevin Johnson to say something as bluntly as this is very, very significant. Again, some of you have seen the letter signed by, I think, 180 CEOs through the Business Roundtable recently. Again, really supporting this perspective. It is a significant sea change, a significant moment of change. But again, as the data is suggesting, there are gaps between what the top of the house is saying and what perhaps the troops in the trenches are really feeling. Sorry, Michael, you were going to jump in there, I know.
No, all I was going to say is we clustered the survey into organizations that were more purpose-driven, or people described their organizations more purpose-driven or not, and we found exactly as you've described, tighter correlations between organizations that describe themselves as purpose-driven and organizations that really did care about making sure those gaps didn't exist or shrinking those gaps. Purpose seemed to be a very important organizing principle, and Johnson and Bastian and all of the CEOs, Brito, all of the CEOs we spoke with really made purpose an organizing principle for how they chose to lead and manage the way they invested in their digital talent and people.
This is another quote that sort of really drives us home from Hewlett Jolly from Best Buy, former CEO of Best Buy. Again, these are very, very powerful statements, very senior people making very powerful statements. I'm reminded of the famous old quote that many of you will know, that if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a capitalist when you're 40, you don't have a head. But what should you be when you're 50 or 60? That sort of left hanging in that famous quote. And somebody like Jolly, I think, is saying here, at 50, at 60, as a very senior leader, you need to have a balance between the two. Being an extremist is not the optimal mix. You need to really be able to balance the needs of multiple constituencies. And again, that's, I think, what this moment of purpose is really speaking to. And then we're going to go into the net purpose score, which is one suggestion in the report, Michael, that you suggested that people might like to think about how they can introduce this into the dashboards that you talked about earlier on. This
is one of those things that began as a joke that we took seriously. Everybody knows how the net promoter score became a very, very interesting way of thinking about your customers. Your customers, whether not just customer satisfaction, but are they prepared to promote you? And clearly, as Ben and Allison have been stressing, we found that purpose really stood out. So we did an acronymic swap, a net purpose score. Would you tell others, this is for inside the organization, would you tell organizations that this organization is well aligned around purpose? Indeed, this is the directly addresses the gap. It's a nice, simple, scalable, cheap metric. In fact, why don't we do a test of it right here? Allison, I think there's a poll question associated.
So we're curious, based on what you've heard from us here, would a net purpose score be helpful to your organization? Take a minute to think about that. Would that scale help you and help your company? I'll just give you a few seconds. Advance warning that we may pick on some of you to elaborate on your response after we see the distribution. So it's not quite a cold call. It's like a tepid call since you know it might be coming. Okay. Okay. So that number, I was watching the ticker of the yeses start a little bit higher and drop down. But first, Ben, Michael, are you surprised by this?
Yes and no. I think most organizations and people in organizations are self-aware enough to know they need simple ways of taking the temperature of how people think and how people feel. The great thing about this, one of the reasons why the NPS, Net Promoter Score, succeed, is not expensive or complicated to do. Similarly with this. And I do wonder, and I think this is clearly one of the important findings that we had, most organizations really aren't aware of how aligned their people feel or are around articulated purpose. So I think that's very interesting. And in the spirit of intellectual property generosity, feel free to use this in your own organization. How's that? Free instruments for testing as a result of this webinar. Good luck with it.
I'm wondering if anyone who said no could elaborate, and just in the chat, submit it in the questions module if you don't mind us paraphrasing and reading out your response. Why do you think it would not be useful? I think if you're not sure, that could very well be, we've given you all of a couple of minutes to digest this concept and maybe think about that, and it could be a tool to use. And to Michael's point, pretty simple diagnostic from 1 to 10. You could do the standard net promoter. I'm already drinking my own Kool-Aid. Net promoter score analysis on that to get the values and look at it in the same way that an organization might look at a traditional score. But for those who said no, just curious if anybody has any immediate answers as to why they don't think this would be helpful. And if no one comes forward, that's totally fine. Understandable.
I do think we need to. Sorry.
Okay, do have fun. I would highlight this because it said this person, I won't expose name, says their leadership wouldn't care if the purpose score is low, so it wouldn't be a useful metric.
There you go. If I may be permitted to be presumptuous, my view, if that's the perception, then the organization may have bigger issues than purpose.
I think to be again, to be fair, if you like, again, this notion of purpose and of this becoming centrally important is a new phenomena. Let's be open about that. This is a new phenomena. So in a way, it's understandable that companies are still struggling really to build the undergirding, if you like, behind the phrase, behind the catchphrase, behind the sort of messaging. I think this is the work ahead for many organizations, is conceptually they're aligned with this, but how do we put in place models, metrics, KPIs, data collection tools, data analysis tools? I think that's a lot of the work that we have to do. So it's perhaps not a surprise that, again, there's still tension in figuring out how to optimize for this kind of new reality. Another aspect of that, just moving forward with an eye on the clock, Allison, is again in this notion of leading by digital example, of this gap between leaders' ability to lead in this new world, is this whole notion of you as an individual leader, what's your attitude, your personal attitude? How do you demonstrate to your people that you're in tune with the times and you're fit to lead in this moment. And I think a lot of this, it may sound reductivist, but I think a lot of it really does boil down to, in this world of context collapse, to communication style, modes, and whether you're comfortable in this new world of social media that we're living in. I mean, are you personally using social media? Did you like it? You know, what's your ratio? Do you turn your nose up when people talk about social media and Twitter? Do you kind of say one thing but really act in a different way? And are you engaged in the conversation, or do you see social media as just a platform in which you can bloviate, but you're not really listening to anybody, not really interested in what anybody else says? I mean, there are clearly some leaders, very prominent leaders, who have a much more sophisticated model to using and speaking to their clients, to their the market at large, to their employees through these channels. I mean, it's we won't mention any names here, but it's not a surprise. There are some people who are obviously optimizing this new channel very well, but the vast majority of leaders stay away from this stuff, are scared of this stuff for all the reasons Michael just said. You know, it doesn't really jive with them. It doesn't really feel good to them. And the rhetorical question that we wanted to sort of understand in the research was based on a simple thought that if you're leading an automobile company, you know, a car manufacturing company, could you do that and not like cars? I mean, that sounds pretty unlikely, pretty ridiculous, but there are lots of people leading companies, and we all know the phrase now that software is eating the world. We all know that every company is a digital company now, but there are lots of leaders of those types of companies who don't really like a lot of this digital stuff we're talking about, and that's the disconnect. That's the gap, if you like, that the research is really highlighting. Michael,
just to quickly to be even more reductionist, Ben, that when I say, do you lead by example? Are you using digital media to express yourself? Do you comment on other people? If you did a survey of your people, how do they see how you lead by example? Because context collapse means more people have more visibility around the way the choices you make and the communications you share. So you need to boost, if you're a leader, you need to boost your level of self-awareness. You need to be aware that whatever you do sets an example. And leading by example in a context collapsed world is a bigger challenge than one where you got to control things. It's like the old joke that 20 years ago, you got to control the brand. Now, because of digital media, your customers and users control your brand. It's the same thing with a leadership brand.
Yeah.
Here's a good, here's Ben, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to, again, with the 9 o'clock, I was just going to suggest, Allison, we go on to the next slide. Because again, this next quote that you see here from Chip Conley, again, I think is a key to a lot of the solutions that we see bubbling up from the research, bubbling up from Michael's work, bubbling up from my travels as well, is this notion of mutual mentorship, reverse mentorship, of more senior folks taking a lead from younger folks, kind of reversing the way that that's typically worked in a large organization. On the next slide, Allison, the data really supports this notion that purpose-driven companies are getting this memo and acting on it in a more material way. They're more likely, 7 times more likely, to have reverse mentoring programs in place, recognizing these new norms, these new mores of the next generation of workers, different attitudes and skills very much in demand at the moment. Need to be pollinated around the business, upwards and not just simply downwards. And again, this is a dashboard. Michael, do you want to pick up here? That helps do that.
Leading by example. We have the excellent, Chip was a wonderful interview about reverse mentorship, mutual mentorship, building an effective dashboard. Basically, the idea there is you have a dashboard for all of your key performance indicators around effectiveness. What about affect? What about affect? This is what Ed Bastian talks about. My example would be around things like sentiment analysis, things around morale. What would your KPIs be if you were concerned about morale, the sentiment of your employees? Everybody, literally everybody that I talk with is concerned about mental health and wellness in this kind of high stress environment. How do we take the pulse of that? How do we monitor that? Well, maybe that was a traditional HR function pre-pandemic, but now this is something that leaders, project managers, everyone needs to be aware of. An affective KPI may be the key to effective KPIs. I think that's an important takeaway, and that's something we develop at some length in the report. Do you want to do the next slide?
Sure, let's talk about leadership networks.
Yeah. I think we're going to play a video here. Allison, is that right? From Ray Reagan's from Sloan.
He was a terrific interview, and you know, instead of looking at culture of an organization, you look at who is the leader networked with. What is the social graph of the leader? What are the social graphs of top management? Very, very revealing as to centers of power and privilege. If we could see that tape, that would be great.
Of my project. My project at the time was describing how people who were similar to each other, how the way they interacted with each other varied as a function of the number of people like them in a situation. Abstract, as one of the words I heard as reused. But it turned out that this very basic idea was useful for the manager. And here's the idea, I hope, in a less abstract way. Imagine that you work in a job, and imagine that I'm able to keep track of the number of people who share a demographic characteristic with you. So if you're a senior manager in a firm, I can measure the number of, for me, it would be the number of African-American senior managers in the firm. In particular, the proportion of African-American senior managers in the firm, or in a job, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to ask, how does the relationship between African Americans vary as a function of their representation as they go from a small number to a relatively larger number? And the basic idea was, let's assume that there's some basic level of interpersonal attraction that two African Americans have for each other. It's constant across the situation, and it's just some small positive affect. But now let's imagine that there are two other pieces to this puzzle. And the first piece is, what if there's a closeness bonus? Meaning there's a bonus that I give to people like me when I feel like they enhance my setting in the situation, when they enhance my standing in the situation. And if I'm part of a numerical minority, you can imagine that people worry. They wonder if I belong. And so when I'm part of a numerical minority, this closeness bonus is high. But as our numbers increase, the magnitude of that bonus goes down.
Can pause there and let folks, if they're interested in seeing this summer series webinar from Reagan's, it's available on YouTube and we'll share the link, but just wanted to highlight that clip of basically talking about the bias of your network and how if it's not expansive and diverse in nature, that could be limiting. It's kind of the upshot of that.
And social network analysis is a way to literally visualize and see the kind of network you have. And this is true whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or the Slack channels that you have, or the Microsoft Teams networks or Outlook email networks that you have in your organizations. Visualizing your networks is a key insight for self-awareness. And Aubrey Blanche, who he was at Atlassian and now is at Culture Amp, again, there's a data-driven aspect of this. It's not just running a program, it's what kind of data are you using so you can identify which individuals and which teams are most likely to benefit from DEI interventions. And then you run experiments in this regard. So you don't just do things in one fell swoop. You use data to focus and target and prioritize what kind of interventions are going to work best, leveraging off the kind of insights that you just heard from Professor Reagan's. So these were our final recommendations. I think we should go to questions, Ben, but
Yes.
we are happy to elaborate on any of these, as you can tell, at great length or as pithily as possible. But these are the recommendations. These are actionable and they're not expensive. The real cost is the cost of introspection. The real cost is the cost of self-awareness.
So in the interest of time, let's jump into questions. We do have, Michael, your statement here. So the future of effective digital leadership requires that affective awareness. I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. Just to summarize for folks where they can find the report and other content that we have co-created on the future of leadership, the links are here. These will be shared in the slides, and we'll be sharing specific links to content we referenced today in the follow-up email as well. So in the interest of getting to our questions, I will invite the speakers to come on camera and we can begin that portion. So I wanted to ask one question, and we talked about this, but I think just to really bring it home, it came in from an audience member a few minutes ago saying, well, right now work from home is what's happened, but there's been a lot more technology change happening for years with AI, other emergent technologies, digital transformation. So why is this relevant now? And we've talked about that, but I think if we could explicitly explain that, you know, I don't think that COVID caused this, and here we are. You know, so if you could speak a little bit more to how these ideas were exacerbated by certain forces, but were already kind of in play, I think that would be helpful.
Well, if I may be permitted to do what is now a cliche quote from Satya Nadella, that basically said we had 2 years of digital transformation in 6 months. Now I'm hearing people saying we have 5 years of digital transformation in a year. So I believe that COVID was a catalyst, beyond a catalyst, dare I say, a global impetus for the, absolutely. Because what's my background is economics. What's the alternative? How would we have done things? How would you shop? How would you deliver things? How could you work without getting more value from more robust, more resilient, more adaptive technology? But the idea that you're going to run your organization the same way in a COVID environment as a non-COVID environment is like saying, really, a sound movie is just like a silent movie, but with sound. What a naive, truly reductionist argument that is. Paul.
And I would just add to that again, with an economic lens on, I mean, people are becoming very familiar with the phrase the K-shaped recovery. Organizations with sophisticated digital channels to market to their employees are faring quite well at the moment, and alternatively, companies that don't are struggling. So that behooves everybody to take digitization more seriously, and consequently, it behooves everyone to take the norms, the mores, the culture, the expectations, the motivations of digital talent, which every business needs to be on the right side of that K shape, seriously. And what the research is highlighting, and the questioner is quite right to suggest that this has all been bubbling up for a while, what the research highlights is that this is mission critical now. This isn't sort of on the edge of the radar. COVID has put this bang in the middle of the radar. And you take it seriously, and hopefully, you know, positive things happen. You continue to ignore this. You continue to think this is kind of, you know, relevance. I think it's pretty clear which way the wind is blowing now.
In terms of other things that are, I think, extremely relevant and need to be paid attention to, the discussion about purpose sparked a lot of questions. And one was this triangulation of purpose, mission, values. And so from one member of the audience, the question was, well, if we don't have a clearly articulated mission, how do we figure out our purpose? And one question was more along the lines of, well, how do you even define purpose as it relates to those other elements of a strategy or an organizational vision? So I wonder if you could comment on those 3 aspects, and how do you start to think about even defining and articulating a purpose, or enabling your leadership to do that if that's not clear to you as a worker and employee in an organization?
I came across an excellent Disney document distinguishing between purpose and mission. The purpose is the why. The mission is the how. They're the deliverables against the why. Carlo Brito, who we spoke with at AB InBev, was, he was not a purpose-driven manager or leader, and he acquired a recognition that purpose was key for AB InBev. That beer is the ultimate social network. And he talked about how this was socialized throughout the organization and how it changed the way they used digital media to build brand and digital and customer experience and support their stores, their distribution channels. So clearly, one of the messages, and this is Ben said this from the beginning, one of the messages is leaders have to own purpose. They have to own purpose. They have to articulate it. And they need to be aware that the best channels for articulating and leading by example around purpose are digital channels. You ain't got no choice. It's not going to be a speech. It's probably going to be a Zoom.
Yeah, just a very specific comment or question around if you would consider Slack a social media channel. And we have a lot of discussions amongst ourselves about Teams and Slack and different things. To your point, Michael, about those are avenues to lead by example. So, is there any distinction you would place on inter versus intra-organizational communication, or public versus private, or anything that we should think about?
I will say, I'm sorry, Ben, I'm just going to do 15 seconds.
Yeah.
I will say that the most powerful thing I have seen CEOs do is choose to comment and promote other people's comments, other people's Slack channel insights, that the CEO is thus shown to be both listening and paying attention and sharing things that he or she thinks are important. That's a way of leading by example.
Yes, and that's the ratio comment in a way that I sort of mentioned earlier on. No, and I think Slack's a great example of it, isn't it? It's a perfect encapsulation of everything we're talking about, that the norm, the style of our personal conversations is now in our work conversations. This is content collapse writ large. And again, the way that younger people, digital talent, is talking, is communicating, is working, is very different to how older generations, frankly. Yes, and so again, that brings absolutely into stark relief all of the things we're talking about. So the senior people want to send an email to the junior people, but they don't want to go and talk to the junior people in the channels that the junior people are talking. That's the gap. So I think what we're going to see, and to give them credit, Microsoft with Teams and the enormous success they're having with Teams is an example of this real change happening in real time before our very eyes. I mean, to again boil it down to simple phrases, you've got to go with the flow here. If you think that this is still kind of crazy and stupid and not how a big business should work, again, that's the purpose gap, that's the digital gap in reality, and you're going to fall in the middle of that gap. I don't think it's going to be pretty.
My slight twist on what he's saying is that if we think things are going to go back to normal after everybody gets their vaccine, I think delusional. That's not self-awareness, that's self-delusion.
Yeah, exactly.
So our survey was extremely global. Our audience today is as well, and some questions coming in about global differences. So I was curious, what sticks out to you? And I'm thinking to some of the leaders we spoke with outside of the US, maybe DBS Bank, for example, in Singapore. Were there different approaches, I guess, starting from digital transformation and then that sort of translation to or growth into affective transformation? Did you see any differences that were more geographically dependent?
Actually, again, my apologies, Ben, but I want to point out, we didn't pick people like Hubert Joly from France, Carlo Brito from Brazil, Kevin Johnson, as all-American as you can get, but as global a company as global can be, by accident. The shocking thing to me, shocking is an overstatement, despite the variety of their backgrounds, what we heard was a commonality around transparency, vulnerability, visibility. I think that is a transcend, I'll use the U word. I thought that was a universal insight. Ben?
No, I'd agree. I think the nature of the modern world, the interconnected world, is that ideas and attitudes and cultures are, transmitted around the world much more quickly, much more materially. But there is a lot of difference at the same time, and we don't overlook that. And probably don't have time to get into some of the detail of that now. But yes, there are big differences around the world, and again, with subtlety and nuance around diversity and inclusion, again, it behooves global leaders to be sensitive to those regional differences, not to imagine that a one-size-all kind of top-down philosophy can be imposed on people. So again, that's the tension that we're all living on, the cusp of that tension in lots of different aspects and lots of different kind of contexts, if you like, all around the world at the moment.
Mm-hmm. With just 1 minute left, I want to ask for a kind of practical takeaway, next step type insight from you both. So obviously the report gives some great advice to leaders and to organizations more broadly. You could think about this at the board level. If I'm a middle manager in an organization and these points are resonating with me, but I'm not seeing them in practice, what are some things I might think about doing?
Be data driven. Get the network flow, the Slack flow, the email flow, the iterations. Use a service like Otter. Get transcripts of the meetings that you're a part of. Try to become more data driven in the way you understand yourself and your people.
Yeah, and I would just finally say on top of that, again, if you're kind of standing on the edge of the pool, you got to jump in. You simply got to jump in and come on in. The water's lovely. You can't stand on the edge of the pool and imagine you're going to win the race in the pool anytime if you're on the sidelines. You've got to jump in and participate, be in the networks, as Michael was saying. Learn this new language, learn these new approaches, because they, as again Michael said, that the genie isn't going back in the bottle and they're not going away. This is the new reality that every organization around the world really faces.
Michael, Ben, thank you for sharing your insights and for this great research. Thank you to Cognizant, our sponsor for this whole project. Really appreciate the collaboration there, and just wish everyone a good rest of your day, and thanks for joining us today.